In a grand medieval kingdom, the king called every noble and advisor into his throne room. He told them he wanted the truth about his kingdom and asked each man to speak freely. One by one, the nobles stepped forward and told the king exactly what he wanted to hear. They praised his roads and his laws and his armies and his name with polished, careful words. The king listened with tired eyes because he had heard all of these words many times before. That same morning, a royal herald rode through the village market reading an announcement aloud. He said the king would hear any man speak freely in the throne room before midday. A poor boy in torn gray clothes and bare feet stopped and listened to every word. While the village men shrugged and walked on, the poor boy looked up at the palace. He stood there for a long moment, and then he began walking up the road toward the gate. The palace guards blocked his path and looked down at him with immediate dismissal. The boy did not step back and did not lower his eyes and spoke to them plainly. The royal herald came to the gate and studied the boy's face and then nodded to the guards. The guards stepped aside slowly, and the boy walked through the palace gates alone. The nobles inside the throne room turned and looked at his torn clothes and laughed openly. The boy stood in the center of the room, completely still, and let them finish laughing. The king raised one hand and the laughter stopped, and he looked at the boy with sharp eyes. He nodded once, and the room went silent, and the boy took one slow breath and began. Every noble in the room expected the boy to stumble or go quiet or look at the floor. The boy did not stumble, and he did not go quiet, and he did not look at the floor once. He spoke about the village roads that had been broken for 3 winters without repair. He spoke about the grain taxes collected from farmers whose crops had already failed. He spoke about the sick old men turned away from the palace healers without a word. He spoke about the nobles who collected the king's taxes and kept a portion for themselves. He did not shout, and he did not accuse, and he simply told the king what he had seen. With every sentence, the smirks on the nobles' faces faded, and something else replaced them. The king leaned forward on his throne and gripped the armrests and did not move at all. A senior noble stepped forward with a red face and tried to interrupt the poor boy loudly. The boy turned and looked at the noble calmly, and then turned back to the king and continued. The king stood up from his throne and pointed at the noble and told him to be silent. The noble stepped back immediately and did not try to speak again for the rest of the day. The king stepped down from his throne and walked slowly across the floor toward the boy. He stood before the boy and looked at his face, and the boy looked back without flinching. The boy spoke his final words quietly and clearly, and the throne room became absolutely still. He said, "A king who is only told what is pleasant will one day rule over nothing pleasant at all." Those words landed in the silence of the room and stayed there, and nobody spoke after them. The king stood very still for a long moment, looking at the boy with eyes that had changed. Then he turned and looked at his nobles, and not one of them could hold his gaze. The nobles, who had laughed at the boy's bare feet, were now staring at their own polished shoes. And the throne room, that had been full of flattery an hour ago, was now full of something heavier. The king walked back to his throne slowly and sat down and looked out over the silent room. He called his scribe and ordered a document written and sealed before the boy left the palace. He walked back to the poor boy and handed him the sealed document with both hands. The boy took it carefully and looked at it, and then looked up at the king with quiet eyes. The king told him that what he had brought into this room today was worth more than gold. He said, "Every noble in this room has spoken to me for years, and not one told me what you did." The boy said simply, "I only told you what anyone walking through the village could see clearly." The king nodded and said, "That is exactly why none of them ever told me, and you did." He turned to the nobles and spoke to them with a quiet voice that carried more weight than shouting. He told them the next man who brought him flattery instead of truth would lose his place entirely. Not one noble in the room said a single word, and not one of them raised their eyes. The boy walked out of the palace with the sealed document tucked carefully under his arm. The guards at the gate, who had blocked him that morning, nodded respectfully as he passed. He walked back through the village market, and nobody there knew yet what had happened inside. He sat alone under the ancient tree at the edge of the village and looked at the document. He thought about all the things he had said and whether he had said them the right way. He thought about the king's face when he heard words no noble had ever chosen to speak. He thought about how strange it was that truth was the rarest thing inside the richest room. And he understood that honesty without fear is the only gift that cannot be bought or faked. Because the most powerful man in the kingdom had everything except one boy willing to tell him the truth.